an introduction to reparations, a general overview of reparations according to our campaign, what's referred to as the ISMA, which is the International Social Movement for African Reparations, and also within a kind of legal concept of what we refer to as international law. Okay, so to just start off by sharing with you that, as Kofi has said, there's a lot of misconceptions around reparations. But both of us, in terms of having legal backgrounds, we often do relate a lot to law, and the law, as well as African people, have been shaping law. So one of the earliest kind of foundations for reparations is in something called the Mandé Charter of 1222, a Mandinka Declaration of Human and People's Rights. So this point that Kofi mentioned earlier about recognizing the histories of the different peoples that we're working with by way of international solidarity, and the knowledge foundation that they base their liberation struggles and their rebellions and their resistance on, is key. So, translated into English, it's stated, if a life is attacked, there is a need to repair. Every life being a life, any harm caused to a life requires reparation. So this is one of the earliest conceptualizations according to African law. But as a concept, reparations is ancient, okay? It goes back centuries. Thank you, moving on. I'm just going to share a bit of UK context to see how this was dealt with. So, William Pitt the Younger, does anyone know who he was?
Youngest ever Prime Minister.
Aha. So this is 1792, and this is British elite view, okay? It's not a people's kind of history, but he said, no nation has plunged so deeply into this guilt as Great Britain. What do you think he's talking about? Any ideas? Yeah. Okay. Next one. Otobo Kugwano, who was born around 1757, he was from the Fante region in Ghana. And in 1787, he published this text, a political treatise called The Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil, Wicked Traffic of the Human Species. Kugwano was the first published African critic of the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans. We don't use the term slave trade in the Stop the Manganese campaign, and many people in our communities do not use the term slave trade, okay? So we talk about a transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans. He was also the first African to demand publicly the total abolition of the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans and the freeing of Africans by way of the abolition of slavery. He also called for a commission of inquiry. So one of the modern day campaigns of the Stop the Manganese campaigns in the UK and at the Europe level is for an all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice. This is some of the ideas that we are basing those demands on. As you can see, this is part of the history of the movement in the UK. And my PhD is actually in the history of the international social movement for African reparations in the UK, which many people don't know about. So this is one of the early landmarks in the movement here. Thank you, moving on. So 1789, William Wilberforce. Do people know who he was? Okay. This was a speech that he gave on abolition, and it was in the House of Commons on May the 12th, 1789. And he said, let us make a reparation to Africa so far as we can by establishing a trade upon true commercial principles, and we shall soon find the rectitude of our conduct rewarded by the benefits of a regular and a growing commerce. What is he referring to? What trade is he referring to? He's referring actually to, it is about capitalism, but the trade in African flesh. So this notion of a slave trade is not coming from the African idea, an African thought. It's coming from the thought of European elites, and that matters in terms of who is defining the parameters of the discourse on reparations. Moving on. Coming to 1926, Sir Austen Chamberlain. Does anyone know who he was? He was actually the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time that he made this statement, and this was in May 1926. Certain crimes are regarded as being, in a peculiar degree, crimes against the human race. His Majesty's government consider that there is a general consensus of opinion in civilized states that the slave trade constitutes a crime of this nature. So this is just some of the governmental thinking. Moving on. This is 1996 now. This is Lucius Berry, 15th Viscount of Falkland, a politician and hereditary peer. There was a debate in the House of Lords in 1996, initiated by somebody called Lord Gifford, and he said, the African people are extremely forgiving. They have forgotten the inequities that they suffered in recent times. To encourage the kind of attitude of fervent desire for reparation here would go against the grain, certainly among Africans, because it is not in their nature. Okay? Then we come to 2015, and this is David Cameron when he went to Jamaica, and he called for Britain and Jamaica to move on from this painful legacy and continue to build for the future. But again, no recognition of reparations. But I already showed you earlier the slide from Cugoano, going back to 87, 91, where that demand for reparation, and in fact, the term that was used is restitution for the injuries, and I'll come on to talk about restitution shortly. So what is the meaning then of reparations? Kofi's emphasized a lot about the importance of knowledge, and we recognize that there can be no reparatory justice without global cognitive justice. Now, what is that? That is the right of multiple forms of knowledge to coexist. When we're talking about internationalist solidarity, it's really important to recognize the different knowledges that the different peoples that we are, even though we're part of one human family, but to recognize that. So this plurality recognizes the diversity of knowledges, not only as methods, but as ways of life. And a quote from Kofi is that the repair of the knowledge is about doing justice to every form of knowledge that exists. And knowledge does not only exist in its European form. So we talk about reparations holistically, and that includes repairing the narratives of our histories and herstories, but also the knowledges that we're utilizing. Okay, moving on. And I'm going again now to African knowledge frameworks, and this is something called the Hosea, which is a sacred text of African people emanating from ancient Egypt, which we refer to as Kemet. And in it we find a concept of restoration, which is healing and repairing the world that is appropriate in discussing reparations. And the verb is sarouj ta. It's part of a phrase meaning to repair and heal the world, making it more beautiful and more beneficial than it was before. Okay? So in other people's conceptualizations, I know amongst Jewish people, they talk about tikkun olam. It's a similar concept, tikkun olam, okay? So Africans, that's the point about recognizing different knowledge foundations. So in Sarouj Ta, we explain that in terms of these 6 principles. This is an ancient conceptualization according to African philosophical concepts on reparations. To raise up that which is in ruins, to repair that which is damaged, to rejoin that which is severed. Now, there's been a lot of discussion, and I know Gail mentions it quite a lot about our, reconnecting, remembering our family. Yeah, that's really important within XR. I've heard, several people refer to that. To replenish that which is depleted. If we're thinking about our earth, our Mother Earth, and how we relate to the earth, these conceptualizations were there, already envisioned by African people, okay? To strengthen that which is weakened, to set right that which is wrong, and to make flourish that which is insecure and undeveloped. Thank you, moving on. So these are two images now from the Reparations March that we have on the 1st of August, which we refer to as Mosiah, because it is about renaming months from August, in terms of Augustus, but looking at African leaders and people who we commemorate in that month. And one such leader is somebody called Marcus Mosiah Garvey. So these two images are from the preparations from the march. We do banner workshops and stuff like that, and you've got the two children here. Reparations is internal and external repair. And then here's a placard. Repair nation is reparations. Repair of our nation. So these are African ideas around what is the meaning of reparations. So internal repair means what we as Africans have to do to repair ourselves and restore ourselves. An essential part of a repair process is transformation, and the notion that nobody can really emancipate the oppressed apart from themselves. And that includes all oppressed groupings. It has to be driven by their own mandate, their own notions of who they are and who they project themselves to be. So the internal is what we owe itself, what we owe each other. But the external, you can say, is what is owed to us by others outside of our specific communities. Moving on. And we utilize two main definitions in the movement, in the International Social Movement for African Reparations. And that ISMA, as the acronym, is part of an internationalist movement, and that's why in talking about internationalist solidarity is key, because in our formulations from a social movement perspective, the African Reparations Movement is the ISMA, the International Social Movement for African Reparations, but that sits in a wider movement which includes everybody else who's got reparation struggles, yeah? Aboriginal peoples, indigenous peoples of the Americas, Dalits, peoples from Asia, including actually peoples from Europe. There are reparation struggles which, when you go into your own history, a lot of the struggles around reclamation of land and commoning of lands and resources, we recognize as repair, efforts to repair some of the disrepair that Kofi has spoken about. So we use, go back to the other slide, two main frameworks or definitions, okay? One we refer to as a conceptual framework, which is Professor Chinwezu. And there's a long definition, but in essence, he says that reparations is about self-made repairs, mental repairs, psychological, cultural, organizational, institutional, social, economic, political, educational, family, because we've got disrepair in our families, relationship repairs, repairs in our self and group understanding and status, repairs to our sense of dignity, value and worth, and repairs to our reputation. That's Chinwezu. And we, within the Stop the Manganese campaign, many of us are part of something called PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe. And in our flyer, which we've got a few at the end, it's got the full definition. Moving on. Reparations must also entail restoring indigenous African knowledge systems of language. Kofi spoke a lot about language. Spirituality and philosophy, music, art and symbolism, and science and technology. Moving on. So now I'm going to give you the operational framework on reparations, which is according to what is referred to as international law, okay? So there's this document, Basic Principles and Guidelines on the Right to a Remedy and Reparation for Victims of Gross Violations of International Humanitarian and actually Human Rights Law. And this was codified in 2005. And it affirms that victims, and when I use the term victim, it's not in that kind of subjugated, denigrating way that we might use it in popular kind of discourse. But in law, to be a victim means that you are recognized as being wronged and having had something done to you. So it's a useful way to identify groups, individuals and people that need a remedy in law, okay? Equal and effective access to justice. Reparation must be adequate and prompt and proportional to the harm suffered. Okay, moving on. So there are 5 key principles of reparations under international law. They are restitution, and that basically means to put a people or a group back in the position they would have been but for enslavement, colonialism, neo-colonialism, genocide, racism, you know, everything that's happened to them. Compensation, which is what most people reduce our reparation to, financial compensation. Rehabilitation, which is not really legally defined, but it includes a whole range of measures, including access to law, legal services, appropriate education, appropriate healing and psychotherapeutic interventions, community cohesion, both inter-community and intra, within communities. Then there's something called satisfaction, which are all the measures that need to be put in place to feel satisfied that there has been a level or some degree of repair. And finally, guarantees of non-repetition, which is how do we ensure that what has happened to a particular group of people never happens again. So I've already kind of explained restitution, but one of the people who is recognized as being an expert, you know, in restitution, Elazar Balkan, he wrote a book called The Guilt of Nations, and he tells us that it's meant to restore the victim to the original situation before the violations were committed. So for us as African people, that would be, what would Africa have been if we had never been kidnapped out of Africa? What would the world have been if that crime, which was a foundational crime in terms of the development of modern capitalism and also the exploitation and dispossession of indigenous peoples in Abya Yala, or the so-called America, and, you know, racialization, the beginnings of it, okay? And it includes the entire spectrum of attempts to rectify historical injustices that have contemporary legacies and manifestations. Moving on. Now, restitution, which is about restoring us to the original situation, can include a restoration of liberty, a restoration of our rights and recognition that we have rights, because one of the things that enslavement did was reduce African people or African humanity to being less than, or 3/5 of a human. And that was actually codified in the US Constitution. And it has been developed in different constitutions and legal arenas in the Caribbean and everywhere where African people are on the planet, actually. It includes restoration of identity, family life, citizenship, and in some cases a return to one's place where they originally came from, restoration of employment, a return of property. So all those Benin bronzes and cultural, sacred, hallowed, cultural property in museums across Europe that belong to African people, that would include a return of that. But repatriation is a key demand of many African groupings, which was about our right to go back to Africa, our right to belong to our motherland again, to have citizenship. And there's been various movements from the time we were kidnapped off the shores of Africa in the 1400s to now. There's been various movements in the early 20th century, the development of Rastafari have been, or Rastas have been a key advocate of these measures of repatriation. Moving on. So I can skip these slides. So this is again a picture from the march, and I'm going to read it. He said, his banner says, "You took us out of Africa in slavery and dumped us in the West. Send us back home. We have been waiting to return since the 1st of August 1834. We will not give away a continent for an island." And that includes the islands of the Caribbean, where many of us were trafficked to and kidnapped to, or the island of the British Isles, the islands of the British Isles, where many of us also have citizenship and reside. Moving on. I can skip this slide. Skip that one. Now, as much as we talk about repatriation, I also want to introduce the term rematriation, which actually precedes a physical return. Now, this is an indigenous concept, and it refers to restoring a living material culture to its rightful place on Mother Earth, restoring a people to a spiritual way of life in sacred relationship with their ancestral lands, reclaiming ancestral remains, territory, spirituality, culture, knowledge and resources. So many of us refer to rematriation, not repatriation, because actually patria is coming from German thinking about what's called Westphalian models of statehood and a notion of a fatherland. Many indigenous peoples, including African peoples, we talk about our motherlands, Mother Earth. You know, that is the connection that we have, not to a fatherland. And it does make a difference because a lot of the disconnection that all of us as members of the human family have is because of the loss of this. And actually our need to return to forms of rematriation, all of us. Okay, moving on. And rematriation is linked to regenerating what some of our leaders refer to as the African personality. And this is somebody called Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of independent Ghana in 1957, Pan-Africanist, and one of those heroes that we commemorate in African Liberation Awareness Month and African Liberation Day, which is today. Now, the African personality refers to manifestations of the cultural uniqueness among Africans as reflected in our behaviours, our social norms, our customs, our values, our beliefs, our religious and spiritual zeal, attitudes, explanations of the cosmos and the supernatural, the social and political systems historically and in contemporary times. Moving on. Okay, can skip this one. Now, for us in PARCO, compensation, we say that receiving the financial component of reparations will be meaningful only if it serves the holistic purpose and strengthens the integral whole of our self-repair process. So the key aspect of the repair is self-repair, okay? But that's not leaving aside external repair, but it's through the self-repair that we will gain the cohesion and build the power to also influence not only others, but also be taken seriously and be united and organized to actually change the world. And obviously, we know that we cannot do that by ourselves, which is why we recognize the importance of the PRIM, which is the People's Reparations International Movement, which is everybody else who's got reparation struggles, who are also struggling to change the world, you know, change the way that the economy works, how we relate to nature, that these are wider human concerns, and that is where there is a common cause. Moving on, please. We can skip this slide. We can skip this one as well. Yep, skip. Skipping a lot. Okay, this is just going into a lot more detail about different examples. I'll stay here a moment. Yeah. This is a scholar from America, and he argues, this is somebody called Dr. Christian Sunkist, and he talks about the importance of preserving a subversive dialogue on reparations. He argues that deconstructing privilege is the only way to avoid the perpetuation of social inequality in black communities. So he argues that simply distributing benefits based upon existing institutional practices, whether received through reparations, i.e. he's meaning compensation there, or not, only reproduces domination at deeper and more subtle levels. So he's really saying you can't just throw money at the problem. That doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't deal with how we got into this situation. It doesn't deal with the social inequality moving on. And he argues that the movement for black reparations, as he refers to it in America, has the potential to transform the political and legal structure of society while eliminating social and economic inequality. But in order to achieve these substantive changes, any reparations model must deconstruct privilege, it must heal the spirit, and it must develop community cohesiveness. And he refers to something that some of our black legal scholars, in particular somebody called Dr. Patricia Williams, who is a critical legal scholar, talks about spirit injuries. There are some injuries which are of the spirit. It's not just about what's happened to the land and what's happening, in terms of the physical structures. It's what happens to the people in terms of systems of oppression. How does that dehumanize them? Okay? Thank you. Moving on. Move on. So reparations is a process, not a paycheck. Yeah? It took centuries for the world to be like it is now, and to undo it, it has also taken that time. And reparations is not something that is in the future. We argue that reparations is a process that is already in effect. Yeah? All the times that people have resisted systems of, that's been part of the repair. All those efforts to kind of eliminate oppressive systems that perpetuate privilege and inequality, even within societies, they are part of repair processes. Moving on. So why is there a need for repair? I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes on this in terms of where we're at now, that locates the Stop the Manganese campaign. We refer to enslavement as a continuum, and that is recognised in 3 phases. So the transatlantic, what we call chattelization era, which is chattel enslavement of African people, that went from, say, around the 1440s to 1865 and thereabout, okay? The era of colonialism, colonial rule or imperialism, and there are some interlapping kind of time frames. But one of the key landmarks here is we take is 1884, 1885, which was the Berlin Congress, and the carving up of Africa into these domains of Europe that is still impacting on us today. So many of the countries and even the identities that African people carry, they're colonial identities. They haven't come from us, or they haven't respected indigenous African polities and ethnicities and nationalities. And then the era of neo-colonialism, referred by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah in his book, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, as the worst form of imperialism. And this is the phase that we're in now. Okay, and we collectively refer to these as the manganese, as Kofi has explained, the African Holocaust. Moving on. Now, we recognise there's something called Cobra, which is a national coalition of blacks for reparations in America. And we learn from each other, we borrow from each other, we influence each other in the movement globally. But they identify 5 key injury areas in terms of what has happened to African people. We've had distortions and injuries to our sense of being a people and our nationhood, injuries in the arena of education, or what we refer to as miseducation, health, criminal punishment or criminal injustice, the prison industrial complex, and wealth and poverty. And as we know, there's intergenerational wealth and there's intergenerational impoverishment. Okay, moving on. And this is from a declaration of a conference that took place in 1993, a PanAfrican Conference on Reparations that took place in Nigeria. And it said, the damage sustained by the African peoples is not a thing of the past. It is painfully manifested in the damaged lives of contemporary Africans, from Harlem to Harare, and in the damaged economies of the black world, from Guinea to Guyana, from Somalia to Suriname. Moving on. Skip this one, it shouldn't be in there again. This is just an interesting quote from Lord Salisbury, 3rd Marquess of Salisbury, and he was a British Prime Minister. We've been engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no white man's feet have ever trod. We have been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where the mountains and rivers and lakes were. This is part of what we're having to redress today in terms of modern day manganese. Moving on. Yeah, that's me. That was me debating Peter Bone, MP, Conservative MP, was on Channel 4 News, and he sort of says, I don't think we should be looking backwards hundreds of years. We should be looking at the problems we have now. Let's face it, slavery is worse today than it was 100 years ago. So I had a different view, of course, but skip that one. Okay? Kwame Nkrumah. Africa is a paradox which illustrates and highlights neo-colonialism. Her earth is rich, yet the products that come from above and below the soil continue to enrich not Africans predominantly, but groups and individuals who operate to Africa's impoverishment. Moving on. Report from War on Want, 2016. Britain's new colonialism. Britain's scramble for Africa's mineral resources. 101 companies registered on the London Stock Exchange. In 37 countries in Africa south of the Sahara, control over $1 trillion worth of key resources. Moving on. And they are oil. You know the damage that oil does. And extracting that. Gold, same thing. Diamonds, coal, platinum. Huge reserves of gas, copper, silver, cobalt, bauxite, and other minerals. So these are not being controlled by Africans. So when we're thinking about the ecocide, which is part of our campaign, we charge genocide, we charge ecocide, we have to recognize the contemporary manifestations of the manganese and who is responsible. We cannot ignore this, because when we look at underdevelopment in Africa, when we look at the refugees, even the climate refugees, when we look at the impoverishment and why people are literally killing themselves to cross the Sahara and end up, many of them dead in the Mediterranean, to come where? What are they coming for? Then we have to recognize this. This is not about hundreds of years ago. This report was just done by NGO here. Okay, moving on. And this is a map. This is Mark Curtis, who authored the report. He's no longer the director of War on Want. But this is a map of Africa and all these corporations, okay, that are literally disemboweling the earth. So and what are the global impacts of what's happening in Africa? It's huge. Moving on. Then there was another report, Honest Accounts, by a number of NGOs. There were 2 versions in 2014 and 2017. It recognised that Africa is losing $192 billion every year to the rest of the world, almost 6.5 times the amount of so-called aid that is given back to the continent. So this shows you it's actually 41, and these are really conservative figures. They can't actually know the true amount. So again, where is all this wealth going, and how is it being misused to actually now put us in a situation where we don't know if we're even going to have a future if we don't stop this, which is why our campaign emphasizes the urgency of the emergency when we say stop the manganese. Okay, moving on. We also talk about genocide, and you know, some people, they think, oh, that's too strong when you're mentioning genocide. But actually, if you, and I haven't got time to go into it now, but if you Google the 1948 definition of genocide according to the Genocide Convention, you'll know that genocide is not actually only mass killing. That is one aspect. But it is an attempt to destroy a group of people in whole or in part through different means. Okay? And the person that actually coined the term genocide and framed it is somebody called Dr. Raphael Lemkin. He was a Polish Jew, and he was very concerned with the extinction of peoples and what happened. And he pointed out that genocide has two phases. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The second, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. So you destroy people's culture, their institutions, their sense of the divine, their sense of what is education, and you impose upon them another idea from another more, a dominating group. And that is what many of us are living under, which is why many of you, especially if you go to universities here, you'll know that decolonization is a big buzzword that is coming up. And it's also come up a lot in XR. Moving on. Menticide is a key part of genocide. And menticide is the deliberate and systematic destruction of a group's mind, with the ultimate objective being the extirpation of the group. And so this is somebody called Dr. Bobby Wright. Again, these are our scholars that many of you will not learn about in your educational institutions here. That, decades ago were putting out this analysis that are only now being listened to by the rest of the world, especially many people who were jumping up and down about decolonization. Moving on. And what enslavement and the manganese has done has brought about a situation of what is referred to as social or civil death, okay? Orlando Patterson wrote a book. He was an African-Jamaican sociologist, Slavery and Social Death. And he spoke about social death coming from the initial enslavement process, where Africans would undergo a loss of identity through such practices of replacing their names. So my name, Esther Stanford-Xosei. Stanford is the name of the people that enslaved my people in Barbados, okay? Xosei is a name that I reclaimed as an African name, but I don't know what my name is. Many of us coming out of the Caribbean have this, yeah? And that is about extinction of our African humanity, all right? Being branded to indicate their social condition of enslaved persons, being given a specific dress code, castration. Each of these acts alienated the enslaved from their previous identities and symbolized their loss of freedom and power. The psychological process of social death included the effect of rejection as a member of society and becoming genealogically isolated through the loss of heritage and the right to pass on that ancestry, okay, to their children, their progeny. So these identities that many of us of African heritage carry today is part of the problem. And even though we're not saying it's about going back to some idyllic past, it's also recognizing that we are living manifestations of that genocide. Because according even to the very conservative legal definition of genocide, genocide was not just about the physical extermination of people. In fact, the greater aspect of the genocide was cultural genocide. So the people can remain, but everything that makes them a people, makes them unique, gets destroyed. And therefore, you also destroy part of humanity, Because humanity can only evolve if we are allowed to flourish and actually manifest that which we have come onto this earth to do as peoples, okay? Now, the term civil death is actually used in the arena of the United Nations, and it means that you do not exist as a human being. You have no collective human rights, except those rights which are granted to you. Civil death means you are in existence, so you're physically here as a body, but you are not known politically in the state in which you reside. As you have no identity in the world, you are rendered a stateless people. So the term BME, Black Minority Ethnic, what is that? A term that has been imposed upon us but is an indication of civil death. Because even in international law, there's something called minority rights. But when the term minority gets used in the UK context, they're not even respecting what minority rights are in international law, which are minority rights are kind of, you know, a particular type of right, but you don't have the right to self-determination. So a big part of our campaigning is about recognize that we're Africans. Recognize our right to exist and to call ourselves and to name ourselves and to reclaim and try and reconstruct that history, that culture, that heritage, that inheritance that is denied to some of us, that makes us human in the world. So when we see many of our community members killing each other over postcode lottery because they are alienated, they're born here but they have no stake in this society, and that is having an impact not just on our communities, it's impacting other communities. That is the nature of the disrepair. It doesn't just stay in one corner of the earth or in one group. It ultimately affects all of us. Moving on. Epistemicide, the process of dispossession or the killing of knowledge systems. Boaventura de Sousa Santos is you know, one of the key theorists, if you like, that come up around decoloniality. Moving on. This is a really interesting image. What do we see here?
White Jesus.
The colonization of the image and conceptualization of the divine. This is in Ghana, a picture that we took when some of us were at a Reparations Conference in 2006. This is how deep it is, because if you know anything about this imagery, you will know who these people were. People that, you know, painters just went out and took off the street. But yet has become manufactured as part of the cultural imperialism, subjugation and domination, and white superiorization and black inferiorization that impacts how we interrelate as members of the human family today. And depending on which end of the spectrum you are, i.e. how closer you are to white or how closer you are to black, does determine how you live in the world and the kind of opportunities that you will have. Moving on. Afrophobia, a term that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. Fear of people and things African. And it has external as well as internal manifestations in that as African people, because of the systems and structures of domination, we can internalize Afrophobia as well. And that is a huge part of this legacy. Moving on. Remember this person? DNA pioneer. Africans are less intelligent than Westerners. Watson. Okay? This is what we're talking about. Pseudo-scientific racism. Moving on. Repeat. We're now in something called the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent, which was declared from 2015 to 2024. And believe it or not, the British government is refusing to honour this United Nations International Decade and the rights of people of African descent. And this was a statement from the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, Flavia Pansiere. In proclaiming this decade, the international community is recognising that people of African descent represent a distinct group whose human rights must be promoted and protected. And within Europe, we're actually a big, visible, minoritized group of in excess of 15 to 20 million people. And there is a big move around recognizing what has happened to us as a group, because you can't address what's happening in schools in terms of school exclusions. You can't address gun crime and knife crime. You can't address racism in the workplace. You can't address the health complexes that we carry unless you recognize this history and how it is still weighing heavily upon this group that is an oppressed group within Europe, that even isn't recognized properly in national ethnic monitoring. Okay, moving on. And this was Ban Ki-moon, who was the 8th Secretary General of the UN. We must remember that people of African descent are among those most affected by racism. Too often they face a denial of basic rights such as access to quality health, services and education. So all this is going on, and there's nothing that we should be doing that doesn't touch on some of these programs of action and this analysis if we're dealing with, again, African people are not just living in Africa. Because then we have to talk about the African diaspora and the bloodlines of African people that you'll find in every people on planet Earth. And that's what the diaspora recognizes, that actually who is African and who Africans will eventually be. You're talking about the planet, yeah? We're not just talking about a small group of people. Because you go to many of the places on the earth, you go to who were the original people, and you'll find that they've been tracing their ancestry, and they say, oh, we're African. African Chinese. African peoples in, the Pacific, in Oceania. In the Americas, Abiyala. Okay, moving on. You can skip these. And then we come in my last 2 minutes to the Stop the Manganese. So this is what we're about. And these are, we have a petition that really is a consciousness-raising tool to bring greater awareness of the fact that we are experiencing genocide and ecocide as a result of this history. And it doesn't just, that kind of shade doesn't just fall on us, but in our petition, we recognize 12 key manifestations of the ecocide and genocide. This is a visual graphic, but some of the things: miseducation, extractive industries, austerity, land grabs, denial of African Mother Earth rights. So this notion of Mother Earth rights that have come out of the peoples of Abiyala, in particular Ecuador and Bolivia, we have our own approaches to Mother Earth rights, of which I've shared some in relation to Suruj Tar. Police brutality, menticide, racist immigration policies, bioweapons of mass destruction, including HIV, AIDS and Ebola, and that's another subject. Reproductive and sexual violence, unemployment and underemployment, forced sterilization, which is still happening, in terms of eugenics. And if you know anything about the development of eugenics, you will know that many of these universities, Cambridge, UCL, University College London, developed eugenics, mastered it, and that those ideas and that thinking proliferated across the world. Moving on. And I'm going to end, you know about ecocide, and we do recognize Polly Higgins' work. I had the pleasure of interviewing her for a radio show I used to do on something called Voice of Africa Radio. This was, going back some years now, to just show you that these connections, even before we encountered Extinction Rebellion, they were happening. We were connecting, finding the people who were promoting some of these ideas and, having this dialogue amongst us. Okay? Moving on. And I'm going to close out on specific initiatives. Okay, this was, we can skip this slide. And in fact, no, skip some more. All right, skip. Sorry. Okay, yeah, you can. Okay, right. So, the march. I'm sure you've heard some of us talk about the African Emancipation Day Reparations March. In fact, this is a slide for the Stop the Manganese campaign, which is taken from this flyer, which was our flyer for last year, and it has the aims of the campaign, and these are just some of the images, powerful images. These are enslaved people in Libya. You all remember that, I'm sure. So this is not a thing of the past, okay? And this is a huge, huge demonstration and gathering, Pan-African and internationalist gathering that we have on the 1st of August every year. And that day is significant. I'll tell you why. Because on the 1st of August in 1833, the British Parliament legislated that enslavers would receive compensation, and that the enslaved who were supposed to become emancipated, which didn't happen, would not receive anything. And so in the British Parliament, there was a legislating of African inferiority and dehumanization by not recognizing the humanity of the enslaved. So when we march on the 1st of August, it is to protest against that decision back then, that it was recently discovered, it was only in 2015 was the taxes paid off in terms of the debt. We were all paying taxes in terms of the debt that was borrowed to pay out enslavers to the tune of what was 20 million pounds at the time, and depending on how you do the figures, it's 200 billion to debt, whatever. That figure is, there are lots of different calculations. But in essence, that was 40% of the national debt of the country, Britain at the time. That debt, which they borrowed from various bankers, was only paid off in 2015. So all taxpayers in Britain, in between that time and then, have been paying off a debt that was used to unjustly compensate enslavers, many of whom were absentee landlords and came and lived here in the UK. So much of the development of Britain, even in terms of the Industrial Revolution, you can't separate it from this history, okay? So we're connected, whether we want to be or not. In the Stop the Manganese campaign, we talk about shutting down manganese crime scenes, all these mining operations. We advocate shutting them down. It's not about corporate social responsibility. We haven't got time for that. Yeah? And so this is a rebellion type, a rebellious type of action that we are openly advocating. And you mentioned, I think, being involved with the Marikana, solidarity campaign. So that is an example, of how this is still in the death and the destruction. And then if you look at even those that are alive and doing this work, the health conditions that they have, and they're not taken care of. And many of these have intergenerational effects, if you know anything about epigenetics, and how we pass on traumas and memories. So it doesn't just affect the people living today. Moving on. There's some repetition here. But, so we have a Stop the Manganese postcard, which is one of our campaigning tools. We have a number of tools that we've developed. And this is where we encourage people to send this postcard to their MPs and go in and talk to them about the impact of the manganese in their local area. So if you've got people working on what's happening around the shutting down of youth centres or gun and knife crime or what have you, we support groups and communities to advocate for themselves and to actually put themselves in the picture. So this is no longer about just what happened to our ancestors. It's about how we are concerned with the impacts of these legacies on our lives today. Yeah. And one of the key demands is a commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice. There's another demand around an international tribunal, something we call the Ubuntu Gotla People's International Tribunal for Global Justice, which will be a true international court, and where many of the other members of the human family who've experienced settler colonialism and genocide and war crimes and enslavement, we will form our own court. And we will have to bring back and restore just law to humanity, not the law, unjust law of the colonizers and those that legalize despoliation and extractivism, okay? and trample over the rights of Mother Earth and the various members of our peoplehood on Earth. Yes. Okay, and I will stop there, I think.